After an extensive and complex criminal investigation named Project Smooth, the RCMP arrested and charged 2 individuals for terrorism-related offenses under various sections of the Criminal Code.
A terrorist plot thwarted. 2 radical Muslim men, neither of whom is a citizen of Canada, one in Quebec, the other in Ontario, charged with conspiring to murder persons unknown for the benefit of, at the direction of, or in association with a terrorist group. That would be al-Qaida. They wanted to blow up and derail a train in the Toronto area. And we need to thank the RCMP and CSIS for stopping them. We need to thank some members of the Muslim community who cooperated in the investigation by giving important info to Canadian authorities. I don't know how many hundreds would have died had this al-Qaida supported, al-Qaida inspired plot been successful. Nobody has a number. But here's something we all need to know. We need to know that Canadians are targets of al-Qaida. We were told that when Americans took bin Laden down, and this week we've been told it again. And so I want to tell that Canadian school teacher who's infecting the minds of her school children to stop preaching nonsense. It's time for some Canadian common sense. The school teacher I'm talking about is not in some madrasa in Pakistan, teaching young kids how to hate Christians and Jews and non-religious Muslims and all the other people madrasa teachers call infidels. The school teacher I want to call BS on is the one who told the kids in her Canadian class last week, just after the Boston bombings, that in this country, children have nothing to fear from terrorism, nothing to fear from terrorists. She was saying this to them after the marathon bombing. She told these kids they have nothing to fear because Canada is a peaceful country. I wish she was the only one preaching this kind of nonsense. What does this really mean? What's the message? The message is, of course, that America is a target because America is not peaceful. America is at war with Islam, with the world. And that's why American kids and their parents are at risk, but not Canadian kids. Now, on this day in Canadian history, after the RCMP have made arrests in Canada of people wanting to blow up at least one Canadian train in the Toronto area, murdering as many Canadians as possible, can you please do me a favor? Can you please tell every school teacher you know to stop poisoning our children with garbage? I don't know how to stop the teachers in the Middle East from infecting kids with hatred. I'm not there. I don't speak the language, and I don't pretend I'm there. I'm in this country, the one that gave my family freedom, and I owe it to my family who brought me here and the Canadian people who allowed us to have an opportunity here at a real life. I owe it to all of you to tell you it's time to talk back to the teachers and the media types and the political types and all the others who, whether they know it or not, are preaching the al-Qaida sermon, which is to say they're enabling the message that those who do not submit in the strictest possible ways to the teachings of the Quran are not worthy of life and are legitimate targets. I'm here to tell you that anybody who wishes to enable any message that teaches our children that a week ago an 8-year-old Martin Richard was a legitimate target, anyone who teaches that is someone who needs to be spoken to and not in soft, politically correct mumbo-jumbo, which we're all tired of. The next time someone tells you that we should accept the idea that we are targets because our policies in the Middle East or because we have been exploiting the rest of the world, because we are seen as oppressors, the next time someone in your life or your head seeks to justify mass murder, you tell them they're doing al-Qaeda's bidding, because that's precisely what they're doing. You see, there's one simple fact of life that is true, whether the enablers want to hear it or not. When people come to this country with chips on their shoulders about the people who live here, the people who live here have a reasonable expectation they'll get rid of the chips, a reasonable expectation that they will become more like us. And if we don't take that position, we will become more like them. Every day in this new version of Canada that appears so dramatically different than the Canada you and I grew up in, we hear Canadians spinning for the bad guys. They're usually suckers for the bogus ideology known as progressivism. They believe in many things that are not true, and most important from a public safety perspective, are not helpful. The core belief of progressivism is that America, and specifically American capitalism and its kissing cousin American imperialism, they are the root of all evil. on the planet. The Americans created it, nourished it, fostered it, and triggered the blowback that is Islamic Jihad. There would be no jihadist movement targeting the World Trade Center or the Boston Marathon or a Via Rail train in Toronto if it weren't for those dastardly Americans. And because we are too close to them geographically and culturally and militarily, we have to expect that much of the world will hate us, especially the Muslim world. America is, after all, Israel's most reliable ally. Israel is used by the American empire to oppress Muslims. As long as Israel exists and America continues to support the Jewish state, we're all vulnerable to attack, say the progressives. There is no authentic progressive who could look me in the eye tonight and tell me that this is not their worldview, not the worldview that they have put into their ideological pressure cooker. And they've been cooking it for years, and they keep on cooking it even tonight. And one day it will blow up in Canada, because one day the RCMP and CSIS won't get the important tip, the information they depend on to keep some other mass murderer from attacking your kids and your grandkids. Look, I could sit here and pound the table about the threat from Islamic extremists, but the threat from them is aided and abetted and accelerated by progressives in the United States and here in Canada. We live in a garbage in, garbage out culture. You want to swallow garbage that progressives teach in the schools and in media and in political activism, you will become bin Laden's most reliable tool, a most useful idiot. You will grant bin Laden a posthumous victory every time you tell your kids that we brought it on ourselves, because there's something wrong with us. Not a day goes by where I don't say to someone or to some group that I love Canada. That's my religion. I'm a believer in Canada, and I believe in you, John and Mary Canada. I believe that we will prevail over the jihadis and their progressive sycophants, stooges, and dupes. That's Canadian common sense.
It is very important that Canadians remain vigilant. Protecting Canada's national security requires the awareness and active engagement of all of our citizens.
Eternal vigilance, the price of our freedom, the responsibility of all Canadians. We can be thankful for the hard work of Canadian authorities to stop the latest alleged bomb plot in its tracks, conspiring to derail a Via Rail train to sow destruction and kill innocent Canadians. Minister Vic Taves, Public Safety Minister, is clear. Public safety is a top priority.
Our government remains unwavering in its commitment to protect Canadians and support the global fight against terrorism. Preventing, countering, and prosecuting terrorism is a priority for our government. Canada will not tolerate terrorist activity, and we will not be used as a safe haven for terrorists or those who support terrorist activity.
Unfortunately, it's not an isolated incident. The terrorist threat in Canada, very real. Here's CSIS head Dick Fadden issuing an ominous warning not that long ago.
The primary threats to Canada's national security remain terrorism, and in particular the danger from al-Qaida-inspired extremism, both domestically and internationally. The radicalization of Canadians continues to be of concern to the service. CSIS is currently aware of dozens of Canadians, many in their early 20s, who have traveled or attempted to travel overseas to engage in terrorism-related activities in recent years.
The CSIS director said that only 2 months ago, ladies and gentlemen. All too often, there's been a Canadian connection with terrorist activity abroad. Canadians among those who attacked a gas plant in Algeria. Canadians enlisting in terror groups like al-Shabaab in Somalia. And of course, there's the threat of homegrown terrorism, the infamous Toronto 18, a group of radicals who were also fortunately stopped before they got started. What's the risk level? How do we keep it at a minimum? Is there even more our authorities are doing and can be doing? We turn now to terror expert John Thompson. John, earlier I was doing a riff in my Canadian common sense about progressivism, and not because I find it intellectually stimulating, but because I think it's dangerous. I think a lot of the progressive ideology disarms Canada because it makes Canadians complacent, makes them think that terrorism is something we can talk about here. We have the odd terrorist maybe born and brought up here going elsewhere. but will never be ground zero for terrorism.
Well, as ever, the butterfly of beautiful expectations has to sometimes meet the windshield of reality. And terrorism is a reality, and it is a growing reality that is actually becoming more and more frequent in Canada.
John, we talk about what the government needs to do. We're congratulating the government, of course, governmental authorities like the RCMP and CSIS. But are there things that the government would like to do but are not able to, simply because they're handcuffed by our own laws? Can you think of any of those that need to be, let's say, reformed?
Well, among other things, the government right now is pushing through legislation, Bill C-17, to expand our anti-terrorism legislation. Now, there's a couple of provisions that were there before in C-56 that are sort of like power tools in the tool chest, power tools that even the police didn't want to use first time around, like the right to arrest someone as a precaution because you're afraid they're going to do something. Also, the power to compel people to testify, which is at odds with our legal system. But other new measures are very useful. For example, right now, if you actually ship off to join al-Shabaab, you're not actually committing anything illegal once you've gone overseas and joined them. If you join al-Shabaab in Canada, that's illegal. If you go to Mogadishu and then join them, that's not. So we're expanding the law so that, say, going overseas to join any terrorist group, terrorist entity, is going to become illegal. That's one of the new things the government's trying to get through. But then we also had Jason Kenney who talked out loud in January about trying to make sure we don't have these 25-year, $3 million legal fights to deport somebody in future, and saying, okay, he'd like to propose a law so that if you were a dual citizen, say if you're a citizen of, for example, Lebanon, and you seek out Canadian citizenship so that you can use your Canadian passport to facilitate your travels as a member of Hezbollah, that we can strip that from you immediately without any other consideration. Or if you've arrived in Canada and you are not a Canadian citizen and you're involved in terrorism, we don't have to spend 25 years and 3 Supreme Court challenges to put you on a plane and get you out of the country.
One of the alleged terrorists living in Toronto for a number of years, committing crime after crime, conviction after conviction, so for all intents and purposes a career criminal. But once again, he's not a Canadian citizen. So I'm just wondering, and I'm sure Minister Kennedy tonight is wondering, why is this man in the country in the first place? Why is he here in a position where he can plot this kind of murder and mayhem? Why is he in Canada?
Well, I mean, obviously he came here with that intention, or that just...
No, my point is, why didn't we put the boot to him several convictions ago? Well, he's not Canadian.
That goes right back to a Supreme Court decision in 1985, in which a member of the Supreme Court wrote an opinion that was upheld by the Supreme Court, that even non-citizens, once on Canadian soil, have the same rights as citizens. And basically what we did back in 1985 was we hung a giant "Kick me, I'm stupid" sign over our necks, and the world reacted. I mean, the first thing was the flood of Tamil Tigers. Up to that time, they were moving people into Western Europe. When that decision came down, suddenly they came into Canada like crazy. And over 200,000 Tamils came to Canada because we made it so easy. It also made it so difficult to deport anybody. So that's another decision that has to be reversed with sound legislation.
John, there's a myth out there, and some Canadians will tell me it's not a myth. They'll tell me it's core to what we're about. I've never bought into this. And the myth is this, and you help me with this, my fellow Canadian, tonight. The myth is that the thing that Canadians care about the most, it's the number one thing that matters to them, is that they're thought of around the world as nice people. Nothing else matters to them more than to be thought of as nice people. Now, that's something I've never believed. But today, if we still believe that, that does make us vulnerable. That does post that sign that you were talking about, the "Kick me, I'm stupid" sign.
Well, a couple of years ago, there was an international Gallup poll project that asked people in various countries what they thought about people from other countries. And yeah, Canadians did come across as being thought of as being nice. Also, it was kind of surprising that we are also highly regarded as being notoriously potty-mouthed. You know, that our language is pretty crude and rotten. So we're not quite achieving the effect we'd like, but that's not the first priority for Canadians. We know what the first priority of Canadians is. Everyone knows. The first priority is jobs, economic performance, you know, making sure that our economy is healthy and our taxes are low.
We want the opportunity to work, and we want to be safe. Those are the top two. If it means that some people think we're tougher than we used to be, we're not as nice as we used to be, you know what? I can live with that, John. How about you, my fellow Canadian? Could you live with the idea that some people think we're not as nice, not as namby-pamby, not as much of a doormat as used to be because of certain incidents we have toughened up, and it means that we're not as nice? Can you live with that?
Look, we're a nation of hockey players. We'll play a gentlemanly game, but if you don't want to play that way, we'll nail you into the boards. We are also the country that bayoneted our way up Vimy Ridge and through Normandy. You know, that, yes, we'll be nice up to a point. And that also speaks to another Canadian characteristic, that we are a nation that is welcoming. I mean, and we are engaged in this great social experiment about sort of bringing the world in and seeing if we can all get along, although there is something that does unite Canadians, is they do not like being taken advantage of. And so if you want to come here, build a new life for you, yourself and your children, fine, welcome. That's part of the Canadian narrative. If you're here with other purposes in mind, you know, we should be able to get rid of you as quickly and efficiently as possible.
So it's wise for the world to understand that we still have our bayonets and our elbows.
Yes, and we're good with them.
John, thanks very much. I needed that. Appreciate the moment.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. John Thompson, ladies and gentlemen, securities expert.